Hello, students of the SPU and the Sky, probably a lot for Form 4. And we're gonna do some explanation in this video. I'm gonna make it 10, perhaps 15 minutes. And it has this topic, socioeconomic control of men and women in the Caribbean. And we're gonna pay extra attention to women under slavery. And the main question is, it popped up, how were enslaved Africans controlled in the British Caribbean? So our focus is on the British Caribbean, but sometimes examples from the French Caribbean or the Dutch Caribbean also pop up. It is from the theme Revolts and Resistance, meant for Form 4. And the main goal from the syllabus is explain the various forms of slave control in the British, French, and Spanish Caribbean. And the important word in this context is explain. You have to be able to explain it. So in depth, within a few sentences, within a short essay, within a short explanation. Explain. You have to be able to tell more about this, what we are doing here. Okay, we'll continue. Yeah, this is handy. So you have to be able to explain it, like I said here. And it is about the theme, revolts and resistance, and is meant for Form 4. And my main question is, how were enslaved Africans controlled and where, especially in the British Caribbean? How were they controlled in the British Caribbean? We will continue with the next slide. And as I said, it is all about explain. Well, yeah, the socio-cultural control and with special emphasis on the treatment of women. Well, picture right to my slide portrays women, Creole women, African slaves dancing and creating their own culture. So culture is a pretty important concept in this. Social cultural control and the treatment of women. Well, culture. What is culture? Culture is everything that people do within society. So singing, dancing, creating music, creating a style of clothing, creating their own language, creating their own cuisine. And why do people do this? People bond through culture. And bonding means they connect with each other with culture. Ja, din papiamento is que está conectar com outra gente. So people connect, they bond through culture. But bonding of one group can also mean a threat for another group. For in this instance, the planters within the Caribbean. So the planters felt threatened by the majority of slaves creating their own Creole culture, and to prevent this, the bonding as a threat, they passed laws against drumming and dancing. So drumming and dancing were perceived by the planters as a threat because they were connecting together, creating their own Creole culture from the different African influences. And this was perceived by the planters as something that was a threat. And that's why the planters passed laws, they wrote laws to prevent slaves dancing and drumming in their own cultural way. So this is very this makes a lot of things clear about what culture meant for the African slaves and later the Creole people. Well, how did planters and European colonizers try to prevent the bonding of African slaves? Well, the first point is there were different African groups within Africa, as the colors point out here, but they also had different cultures, they had different languages, they had different ways of life. So that is important to know at first. Yeah. So when people of the same culture and the same background and the same place in Africa would be put together, it would be easy to communicate and plan revolts. That's why the planters did not do that. And when they mixed tribal groups from Africa, when they mixed them, yeah, they were sometimes in conflict, so they would not revolt together because they could not bond together. Also, that meant that all of these people from Africa had different languages. Also, it makes it difficult to bond together. Está difícil para conectar toda gente. So these were ways in which the planter could make sure that their slaves would not bond as easily. What they also did was that different slaves got different privileges. House slaves got different privileges. Drivers who had to make sure the slaves worked very hard by whipping them and by punishing them also had different privileges. Yeah? And by creating these different privileges for different groups of slaves, uh, they also created an alliance with some parts of the African slave groups. And this example is telling some rebellions were stopped because one of the slaves, the African slaves, betrayed the other slaves by telling the planter that they were planning a revolt. So there are instances known to us in 2023 that we know of that rebellions were stopped because of betrayal of another slaves, trahison. Yeah? Um, so we have a lot of examples in the British Caribbean of this happening. Okay. What also was a way in fighting against slave resistance and fighting against bonding between the slaves was preventing their economic independence. For instance, in the British Caribbean, there was written a law against slaves keeping horses. The horse was like the car of the 17th and 18th century. You could move around. You had independency. So if you could prevent slaves keeping a horse, they could go around less easy and they had less freedom of moving. And this was also preventing economic independence. Against selling fish, something that is on Curacao, of course, very common. And fish, people eat it a lot, so you can earn money to become independent. So that's why planters, European colonizers, made laws against keeping fish and selling fish, of course. These laws, by the way, were even often ignored by the planters and European colonizers themselves. For instance, if a planter had a skilled artisan, so a skilled, in Dutch we call this an ambachtsman, he had certain skills that were important, like creating iron. In Dutch we call it a smidse, a smith, yeah, a blacksmith in English. If he could do that very well, he would lend him to other planters, and of course the slaves would earn some money. So again, we see there were slave laws, but not always the planters did not always keep themselves to the slave laws. Not even the European colonizers themselves always listened to these laws. But their purpose was to prevent economic independence of the African slaves. How was the experience of slavery for women? Well, this picture is, of course, exemplary. It comes from the book that John Stedman wrote while he visited Suriname because he had to put down a slave rebellion there and fight against the Maroons. How was it, especially for women? Well, for women, it was as harsh as for the men, but only concubines might, so not always, but it was possible, have received better treatment. A concubine is an unofficial wife of a white European colonizer because they often did not bring their wives and often they were not even married. So, unofficially, because officially it was not allowed to marry a black person or a person of color by a white person. It was not allowed for them, but only concubines might possibly have received better treatment because they, uh, in the best case, the European colonizer, the man within this relationship, cared about the women, or even if they didn't, they would have treated them better for their sexual services or because they were the mothers of their children. But for women, often their families were separated when arriving in the Caribbean, and the men were deprived of their role as a man within the family. They could not be fathers for their children, they could not be providers for their children, they could not be the protectors of their wives and children. So their role as a man was emasculated. It means they were deprived of their role within the family as a man. And often women were sexually abused, and this was, of course, also possible for a concubine because possibly she was the lesser, she had less power within the relationship. About enslaved women. Yeah? Enslaved women also had to work on the plantations. So often they did not have privileges. Yeah? They also often were working in the fields, like you see above. But at Sunday markets, they were crucial. On Sunday, women were allowed to visit Sunday markets and sell their fruit and their corn there from their own pieces of land. Yeah. And there they could spread news, or they could be a little bit economic independent, or they could make contact with other people there. Also, the women teach their children about indigenous African culture. So, in the passing of culture, of traditions, of religious practices, of traditional practices, in the sense of telling people stories. On Curaçao, think about the story about the spider Anansi. Yeah, this was passed down by the mothers and the women within the African slave culture. Yeah? So the women, enslaved women, were within the culture of African slaves, and Creole slaves were very important in creating that culture. But of course, also rape, sexual assault was something that happened a lot and something the women had to endure much more than the male slaves. And a lot of women were traumatized, sexually assaulted, and raped. This even started within Africa, and in the passage coming from Africa to the Caribbean or South America, in the passage from Africa to the Caribbean or South Africa. So from the beginning, women, African slaves, were subjected to rape, sexual assault, and trauma coming from, of course, planters and European colonizers and Europeans working on the ships. Having said this, I end this video, and it was about how were enslaved Africans controlled in the British Caribbean, and it was meant for Form 4, and the theme was Revolts and Resistance. And this is the goal taken from the syllabus. The important word here is explain. You have to explain it, be able to write an essay, be able to use a short story to give your answer concerning this topic. And I hope you learned a lot from this video, and I hope you to see you during class. And if you have questions, post them below, and don't forget to subscribe, and don't forget to share the video with your classmates. I wish you a very nice day. Keep on drinking and enjoy your study of this topic if you are indeed studying. Have a very nice day.